Welcome to our third video on Abraham's story as we explore reading the Bible as a story. In this video, we're going to be examining Abraham's time in Egypt, and we're calling it Abraham's failure in Egypt because it's quite similar to Adam and Eve's failure in the Garden of Eden. Well, in Genesis 12, 1-9, we saw that God starts over with Abraham and promises to bless him and all nations through him and to give him land. And this is reminiscent of the blessing of humankind in Genesis 1, which was repeated later to Noah in Genesis 9. And it's also reminiscent of the placing of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden and Noah in a world washed clean of sin. Abraham and Sarai walk through the land that God promises them. Abraham and Sarai are like a new Adam and Eve, whom God has blessed and put in the land as a new Garden of Eden. And in keeping with the repeated pattern from the stories of Adam and Eve and Noah, we are to expect that after God blesses humankind and places them into the land that he gives them, there will be a fall. In Genesis 12, 10-20, we discover that Abraham falls in Egypt like Adam and Eve fall in the Garden of Eden. Let's read the story. Now there was a famine in the land. So Abram went down to Egypt to sojourn there, for the famine was severe in the land. When he was about to enter Egypt, he said to Sarai, his wife, "I know that you are a woman beautiful in appearance, and when the Egyptians see you, they will say, 'This is his wife.' Then they will kill me, but they will let you live. Say you are my sister, that it may go well with me because of you, and that my life may be spared for your sake." So after obeying God and moving to the land where God told him to move from, his security, his family, his country, his kindred, there's a famine in the land that God takes him to. And Abram must be wondering at this point about whether he made the right choice in moving in obedience to God. And so I believe there is fear, but he responds to his fear with self-reliance. He chooses to go down to Egypt and to live there. Now notice that the text does not say that God told him to go down to Egypt. He's doing this because he's trying to find his own way of taking care of himself. He's acting out of fear. And as a part of his fear and self-reliance, he asks his wife to lie with him that she is his sister, thereby exposing her to danger and making her vulnerable. Also that, in his words, "I will be treated well for your sake, and my life will be spared because of you." Abram's reasoning is that if the Egyptians think that Sarai is his wife, they'll kill him to have her. But they will let her live in order to acquire her as a wife. However, if they think that she's his sister, then they don't need to kill him. They can negotiate with him and give him a bridal price in order to gain her as a wife. He's got it all figured out. So when Abram entered Egypt, the Egyptians saw that the woman was very beautiful. And when the princes of Pharaoh saw her, they praised her to Pharaoh. And the woman was taken into Pharaoh's house. And for her sake, he dwelt well with Abram. And he had sheep, oxen, male donkeys, male servants, female donkeys, and camels. So the Egyptians saw that that Sarai is very beautiful. And she's taken by Pharaoh into his harem, and Abram is treated well for her sake, thereby acquiring more possessions. Abram's plunder consists of animal, flocks, and slaves, both of which will cause problems later in the story. And so Abram gained his wealth at the expense of others, at the expense of making his wife Sarah vulnerable, and at the expense of deceiving Pharaoh and the Egyptians. And Sarai is noticeably quiet throughout the entire spectacle. And that leaves us to wonder what she thinks or feels, even as she acquiesces with Abraham's scheme. And so we read next that the Lord afflicted Pharaoh and his house with great plagues because of Sarai, Abram's wife. So Pharaoh called Abram and said, "What is this you have done to me? Why did you not tell me that she was your wife? Why did you say she's my sister, so that I took her for my wife? Now then, here is your wife. Take her and go." And Pharaoh gave men orders concerning him, and they sent him away with his wife and all that he had. Now God has to intervene, because left to Abraham, Sarah would be in trouble. And as a result of Abraham's deception, God inflicts some serious diseases on Pharaoh and his household. This is a foreshadowing, of course, of the plagues of Egypt that would be brought by God in order for his people to be sent away from Egypt to the promised land. But here, Pharaoh has been deceived by Abraham. And so Abraham brings curses, not blessings, on the nations. God enters into this relationship with Abraham with the plan that Abraham is going to bring blessing. But here, because of Abraham taking care of himself out of fear, leading to deception, he brings curses and not blessing on the nation of Egypt. God curses Pharaoh because Pharaoh's actions bring harm, not good, to Abraham, albeit he was not aware that Sarai was Abraham's wife. And so you'll recall that God had told Abraham that anyone who dishonored him, that God would curse. And so God is true to form demonstrating to Abraham that he would take care of him. He only needed to rely on him and not to try and take things into his own hands. There are parallels between Abraham's journey into Egypt to escape famine and his expulsion by Pharaoh, and Jacob's journey to Egypt to escape famine. And also parallels between Abraham's expulsion from Egypt and the Israelites' later exodus from Egypt after being sent out by Pharaoh after Egypt experienced the plagues from God. But in the Abraham story, it is Abraham and not Pharaoh who is guilty of misconduct. And there are also, importantly, parallels between Abraham's failure in Egypt and Adam and Eve's fall in the Garden of Eden. So, I want you to notice that there are repeated words, patterns, and motifs from Adam's and Eve's fall in Genesis 3 in the story of Abraham's failure in Genesis 12, which tells us where to compare these stories to discern deeper meanings the biblical writers are intending to convey. We're putting into practice some of our reading the Bible as a story and repetition as a significant feature of how we are to compare slightly different aspects in different stories to get at the deeper meaning. And so, back to the slide, Abram's failure in Egypt is parallel with Adam and Eve's fall in Eden. Abram's failure in Egypt in Genesis 12:10-20 has several terms and ideas in common with Genesis 2-3. Notice, for instance, that both Sarai and the trees of the garden are described as beautiful or pleasant in appearance. Sarah in Genesis 12:11 and the trees in the garden in Genesis 2:9. Subsequently, there is a seeing and a taking of the desirable person or fruit. And if we compare the two stories closely, we can identify a lot of repetitions intended to show us that there's a parallel between them the biblical writer intends for us to meditate on. Let's compare the two stories by first reviewing Genesis 3. So in Genesis 3, we read that the serpent was more crafty than any other beast of the field that the Lord God had made. He said to the woman, "Did God actually say, 'You shall not eat of any tree in the garden?' And the woman said to the serpent, 'We may eat of the fruit of the trees in the garden, but God said, You shall not eat of the fruit of the tree that is in the midst of the garden, neither shall you touch it, lest you die.' But the serpent said to the woman, 'You will not surely die, for God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil.'" Now I want you to notice first of all that they are in a garden. And next, I want you to notice that there is a deceitful and crafty serpent or snake in the garden. And I want you to also notice that the woman is being deceived and tempted by the serpent into taking and eating fruit of a tree that is forbidden to her. Well, the story continues. It says, "So when the woman saw that the tree was good for food and that it was a delight to the eyes, and that the tree was to be desired to make one wise, she took up its fruit and ate. And she also gave some to her husband who was with her, and he ate. Then the eyes of both were opened, and they knew that they were naked." And then what happens is, after they blow it by doing what God told them not to, God comes to them and says, "What is this that you have done?" He asks that specifically of the woman. And therefore, because of what they did, God sends them out from the Garden of Eden. Now, I want you to notice that the woman saw, the Hebrew word there is ra'ah, that the tree was good. The Hebrew word is tov, and attractive and desirous in her eyes. And she took lakak, and she ate, and she gave to her husband, and he ate. Now in Genesis 1, good or tov is what God sees as good and gives to mankind. Here, good is what humankind sees as good, even though God says don't take it. And what mankind takes, even against the will of God. Now when we compare this to Abraham, he's going according to a plan that he has come up with because of what he knows. This is what is good in his eyes. And then we read in Genesis 3 that they knew that they were naked. This means that the knowledge that they received is a disappointing result than what they had anticipated they would have received by disobeying God. God asks the woman, "What is this that you've done?" And he sends them out of the garden. This is a repeated pattern throughout the Hebrew Bible. This idea of seeing what is good in one's own eyes, taking what one desires or doing what one wants against God's will, leading to disappointing results that cause chaos. This is repeated, as we will see right now in Genesis 12, but the same pattern of seeing, taking, chaos is also repeated in Judges 7 with Achan's sin, and with David in 2 Samuel 11 with Bathsheba. You could read those on your own. But to our story here in Genesis 12, there are images or motifs from the garden scene in Genesis 3 which are repeated in Genesis 12. But as is usually the case in Hebrew narrative in the Bible, these are repeated with some variation, not with exact correspondence. And you recall that the difference is to serve for us to make a comparison, and by noticing the subtle differences, to understand the message that is being conveyed. This is how parallelism works in Hebrew poetry, to give us a greater depth of perception by seeing slightly different realities in comparison to the slightly different angles our two eyes have that give us a greater visual perception. So what we have here in Genesis 12 is that Abraham is the snake, because Abraham is the one who is deceiving. So this is a slight variation in Abram's story, intended to give us a deeper perception and understanding of what is taking place when we compare it to Genesis 3. And secondly, in Genesis 12, the location of the drama and identity of the persons playing the cast of characters from Genesis 3 is moved around. So Abram plays the role of the snake. Sarah is the tree with fruit. And that shouldn't surprise you, because in the Bible, human beings are portrayed as metaphorically as being trees, because humans have seed and they produce fruit. And Adam and Eve, in Genesis 12, Pharaoh and the Egyptians are in the role of Adam and Eve. And the garden is Egypt. The Garden of Eden is parallel to Eden. So, by means of these parallel repetitions from the story of Adam and Eve in Genesis 3, in the Garden of Eden, Abram's failure in Egypt is being compared to the fall in Genesis 3. Well, you may wonder, well, so why do you say that Egypt is parallel to the Garden of Eden? Well, the story of Abram's failure takes place in Egypt, where Abram goes to escape the famine. And in Genesis 13:10, we're told that Egypt is described as being like the garden of the Lord. We read there that Lot lifted up his eyes and saw that the Jordan Valley was well watered everywhere, like the garden of the Lord, like the Garden of Egypt. So Egypt is definitely here compared with the Garden of Eden. So Abram is in the Garden of Eden, in a sense, when he goes down to Egypt. And in this garden, Abram asks his wife Sarah to lie and to say that she's his sister, so that the Egyptians do not kill him for her. And in doing so, he's being like the snake in the garden, in deceiving others into taking what they should not and exposing them to curses from God as a result. Abram relies on his knowledge of what will happen in Egypt instead of trusting God's promise. And that is parallel to Adam and Eve seeking their own knowledge of good and bad instead of trusting God's commands. And there are a number of threads here linking us back to Genesis 3. But in this passage, Abram is a crafty deceiver. He's in the place of the serpent. He is the son of the snake from Genesis 3:15. But to go back to the slide, you can see he says, I know. That is what is good in his eyes. He says, when the Egyptians see you, they will say, this is my wife. This is his wife. Then they will kill me, but let you live. He's getting her to lie. And then what happens is that when he comes to Egypt, the Egyptians actually do see, Ra'ah, that Sarah was very beautiful, like the beautiful trees in the garden. And when Pharaoh's officials saw her, they praised her to Pharaoh. That's like Eve telling Adam to take from the fruit of the tree, and then Sarah is taken like Eve takes the fruit, and Adam eats at his wife's encouragement. Now, Genesis 3:15 is a significant verse in the story of the Bible, because there, after the man and the woman sin in the garden, God curses the snake by saying that he's going to put hostility between the snake and the woman. So there's going to be hostility between the snake and the woman. But secondly, between the offspring of the snake, and these are not baby snakes, these are people who follow the snake, people who lie and deceive and cause death. And the offspring of the woman, which is humanity, who are following God and not following the snake. And then one particular member of the woman's offspring, will bruise the head of the snake, and the snake shall bruise his heel. So there is supposed to be one descendant of the woman who is going to deal with evil at its source and destroy the snake. Now, because Abraham is in the line of Adam through Seth, through Noah, through Shem, and not in the line of Ham, and Pharaoh and the Egyptians are not in the line of Shem, but in the line of Ham, we could think that Pharaoh and the Egyptians should be the seed of the snake. But it turns out that Abraham is the seed of the snake in this story, and he's not being the seed of the woman who's to bring blessing to all humankind, because he's chosen to be deceitful and to bring a curse on the nations instead of the blessing that God wants to work through him. And so we read that when Abram came to Egypt, the Egyptians saw that Sarai was a very beautiful woman, and the officials saw her, they praised her to Pharaoh, and she was taken into his palace. So the Egyptians, like Eve, are deceived by Abraham, who's acting like the snake, and like Eve saw, Ra'ah, that the woman here, Sarah, is desirable. The Egyptians, in the role of Eve, take her for Pharaoh. And so the Egyptians are parallel to Eve, and Pharaoh is parallel to Adam. So Sarah is in the role of the forbidden fruit of the tree that is desirable in the story. And as I said earlier, human beings are portrayed in the Bible as trees by virtue of having seed that will produce fruit. Now, the taking of Sarai by Pharaoh as forbidden fruit results in God inflicting serious diseases on Pharaoh and his household, which is parallel to the curses and consequences inflicted by God as a result of Adam and Eve's disobedience in the garden in Genesis 3. And so we read there that the Lord inflicts serious diseases on Pharaoh and his household. And then we read next that Pharaoh summons Abram and says, "What have you done to me?" Which are the words that God says essentially to Eve, "What is this that you have done?" And he tells him to take his wife and go, and he's expelled from Egypt, similar to how Adam and Eve are expelled from the garden after their sin. So Abraham is being expelled like Adam and Eve. However, unlike the story in Genesis 3, it is the deceiver and the fruit that are expelled from the garden in Abraham and Sarai. And so we have that repeated pattern. We have Abram doing what is wise in his eyes, what he knows, instead of relying on God. And by seeking to protect himself, he puts himself in the center, in the place of God. And what happens as a result is disappointing results that lead to chaos in his family. As I said earlier, we wonder what Sarai was feeling about this. And then ultimately we know that he leaves Egypt with an Egyptian slave, which is going to be the source of some more chaos a little bit later in the story. Now, one of the questions we have to ask ourselves is, why does Abraham lie? And what he tells us in Genesis 12 is that he is afraid that the Egyptians, when they see Sarah, they're going to take her and they will kill him. So ultimately, he is being driven by his fear. In Genesis 20, when he does a similar thing with a different ruler, Abimelech in Gerar, Abimelech asks Abram, "What was your reason for doing this?" And Abram tells him, "I said to myself, there's surely no fear of God in this place, and they will kill me because of my wife. And when God had me wander from my father's household, I said to her, this is how you can show your love to me. Everywhere we go, say of me, he is my brother." So ultimately, what is driving Abraham here is fear. Fear is at the heart of Abraham's actions in Genesis chapter in this incident here in Egypt, where he puts his wife at risk. He's trying to take care of himself because he's afraid that he is going to be harmed. And in protecting himself, he exposes his wife to harm, and he exposes Pharaoh and the Egyptians to a plague. But where God wants to take Abraham to, God wants him to move from that place where he's acting out of fear. And so God tells him in Genesis 15, do not be afraid. And where God ultimately takes Abraham is to a place where he fears God. And his fear of God is the equivalent of trusting God. it is the equivalent of faith. In Genesis 22, Abraham will respond with faith instead of fear by letting go of Isaac. And by doing so, he will become a blessing to all nations instead of bringing a curse. So God is on a journey with Abraham. He's trying to take him from where he found him, where he acts out of fear, and he's trying to take him to a place where he is guided by faith. But this is not a straight in Abraham's journey. In Abraham's journey, growth is not a straight line, but involves a lot of detours along the way as you try to move from point A to point B. It's a lot messier than a straight line from point A to point B. And so if we look at the journey that Abram takes, he starts in Genesis 12 with some faith in leaving his security to go to Canaan. But remember, there's some fear mixed in there because he doesn't obey completely. He carries his family, he stops part way, he is trying to act in faith, but there is some fear there. He's clinging to some of the things that would offer him security. And there is also, when we get to Genesis 12, 10 to 17, which we just read, he reverts to fear. He starts, and it looks great. He starts with acting in fear and going to Canaan, and we're like, oh, great, he's showing faith. But his next move is to act out of fear by exposing his wife to the Egyptians to protect himself. And in Genesis 13 to 14, Abram, though, rebounds with faith. He shows faith by leaving his security to go to Canaan initially, and here in Genesis 13, he shows faith by giving Lot the pick of the land and rescuing Lot and not taking any of the plunder when he deals with the Mesopotamian kings. In Genesis 15, Abraham shows faith by believing God's promise to give him offspring like the stars. But he shows fear by asking God, how will he know that he will get the promised land, and God has entered into a covenant with him. And then he shows fear when Sarah says, well, let's have a child through my maidservant Hagar. He doesn't trust and wait on God to fulfill the promise he's given him. In Genesis 17, God institutes a covenant of circumcision with Abraham, and Abraham obeys, immediately showing faith, but there's fear there because he laughs when God promises Sarai will have a child. In Genesis 18, he intercedes with God for Sodom, in a sense, bringing blessing on his nephew Lot by his intercession. He's growing his relationship with God. But in Genesis 20, he reverts to offering his wife to foreigners to protect himself in the story with Abimelech. In Genesis 21, we have the story of Ishmael, who he sends away because of what Sarah says, but there is some faith in his wranglings with Abimelech. And then we get to Genesis 22 finally, and this is a summit with Abraham where he demonstrates faith by letting go of Isaac, and God says, fears God, and he's now able to bless him. And he ends his life in Genesis 23 to 25 with Sarah's burial, with the finding of Rebekah, and with giving everything to Isaac. He ends his life on the basis of faith. So we're going to continue on this journey here with Abraham in our next class. And I hope that we will see you then as we continue to explore Abraham in Genesis 13 and 14.